So trying to fix diversity directly is fixing the symptom. And the analogy that I tell people is that imagine that I was in the house and my wife came to me and said, "Oh, honey, it's so cold. Look, the thermometer reads only 11 degrees centigrade." And I say, "Oh, honey, I'll fix that." And I light a match under the thermostat. And now look, the thermostat reads 25 degrees. And meanwhile, the windows are open, the door is broken, and the roof is leaking. And when we try to stuff diverse employees, especially at the entry level, that's all you're doing. You're not fixing the problem, you're fixing the symptoms.
Hi, my name is Nadia Nagamutu, business psychologist, coach, speaker, and founder of Avenir Consulting, which creates organisational growth and success via inclusion and diversity. We've been discussing the benefits that diversity brings to a company's bottom line performance for decades with more and more evidence. But there are so many questions organisations still have about how to achieve it. How do you create a culture where people feel valued for their uniqueness and the qualities they bring? I believe it's crucial to the future success and sustainability of every organisation that they find the answer to this question to make sure that each employee is not only supported but also appreciated. With this podcast, I aim to get some of the key challenges to creating inclusive workplaces out in the open and start uncovering the solutions to embracing a culture that cares for everyone. I'm going to be having conversations with some of the most inspiring people in different countries and across industries who are pushing the boundaries on inclusion and diversity in the workplace, from topics such as parenting in the workplace, ethnicity, age, gender, mental health, and all things inclusion. I want to create a movement to change society through sharing life experiences and creating more empathy and connection. Why care? I believe that once we have organisations and societies that accept and value everyone for who they are, we become healthier, happier, and better in our roles both inside and outside work.
Hello, and welcome to episode 29 of the Why Care podcast. My name is Nadia Nagamutu, and I am your host. In this episode, I get to discuss all things measuring inclusion, backlash, and DEI myths with the brilliant Paolo Gaudiano. Paolo is president of a non-profit research organisation, ARC, chief scientist of Aleria, adjunct associate professor at the NYU Stern School of Business, and chairman of the annual Diversity and Inclusion Research Conference. He has decades of experience in business, technology, and academia to transform how people think about diversity with the ultimate goal of making our society more inclusive and equitable. Paolo is a Forbes contributor on diversity and inclusion and is a sought-after public speaker, having given hundreds of presentations in the US and abroad, including a TED Talk. We discuss the science behind the simulation Paolo has developed to demonstrate the impact bias has in shaping the overall diversity of an organisation and the consequences on their financial bottom line. Paolo helps unravel some of the complexities surrounding DEI by busting some myths and using helpful analogies and stories. He offers some fascinating insights for leaders and DEI professionals. Enjoy. Paolo, it is amazing to have you on the Why Care podcast show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Nadia. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm excited because actually we have only communicated on LinkedIn. You were very generous with my just cold message, having never spoken to me or heard my name before, in saying yes to joining me. So I'm very excited to learn about you and all that you're doing in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, that's very kind of you. In fact, I'm flattered to be part of your podcast. I've seen some of the amazing participants that you've had before, so it's quite an honor for me to be invited. Thank you so much.
Oh, no. You are part of the amazing lineup. I would love to know more about your career background. How did you end up working in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I found myself recently reflecting on that because I jokingly tell people, if you look at my background, I started out studying math and computer science, and then I did aerospace engineering, eventually fell in love with the brain and had a PhD in computational neuroscience. So I joke with people that have done rocket science and brain surgery, and then eventually ended up in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I happen to think is much harder than the first two things that I did. But something that happened to me the first time that I went to the US as a teenager on vacation, my dad was a visiting professor at UC Santa Barbara. And so we spent a couple of months in a small town called Goleta, right outside of Santa Barbara. And I didn't speak any English. I was learning it on the street, playing with people. And I made friends with this young black kid. And we would play, and I picked up a little bit of English, and his younger brother played with my younger brothers. And then one day, a couple of weeks later, he asked me a question. He said, do you think I am a Negro? And I was kind of perplexed because I came from a country where there were extremely few Black people, and the name that we used, which didn't have a negative connotation in Italy, was negro, which is very similar to nero, which is the color black. So when he asked me again, I kind of looked at him and said, yes. And he jumped on me and he started hitting me. And then kind of ran off. And I was like, what just happened? And when I explained it to my parents, who had lived in the United States for a few months earlier, they knew exactly what had happened. And they went to talk to this kid's parents, tried to explain the situation, but he never wanted to play with me again. And at the time, I just thought, this is very strange. And then over the years, I realized that essentially it was my first encounter with racial context in the United States and the challenges of that. And I also, over time, came to appreciate the fact that for me, it was an uncomfortable experience that was driven by our difference in culture, the difference in our skin color. But for him, it was something that he had to face every day of his life as a Black person in America. And that memory stayed with me. And later on, when I eventually came back to the States to study university, and then I became essentially a full-time permanent resident and now citizen of the United States, the memory stuck with me. And I really followed through for years. And I was very interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it wasn't until 2015 when I had literally a light bulb moment. I was sitting in a session on, I forget, it was about how to get more women into technology or how to get more people of color in advertising. And I always gone to sessions like that. And I was really struck by the stark difference between the experiences that people described that resulted from their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their religious beliefs on the one hand. And on the other hand, when it came to solutions, it was these vague ideas. Oh, we got to change the hearts and minds of corporate America. We got to change our economic system, our education system. And there was this huge gap. And then the light bulb was realizing that the work that I've been doing for almost 2.5 decades had all been focused on understanding and quantifying the link between individuals and the collective. So this could be a person working in a company, or a driver on a highway, or a soldier on a battlefield, and so on and so forth. And the work that I've been doing was about using computer simulations and kind of a combination of behavioral science and computer science to help to quantify those links. And so I thought, wait a second, I may be able to apply this to a field that has been a personal interest of mine, because it's possible that I can use these simulations to quantify how the experiences of individuals in an organization impact not only their behaviors and their attitudes, but ultimately how the collective behaviors of all the people influence the company. And I thought, if I could prove that treating people more fairly and more equitably will actually make the company perform better, that would be a great way to convince people who look like me, white, male, cisgender individuals, that there is real value in embracing DEI. And that's what happened. I literally dropped everything that I was doing. I spent about a year developing some simulations, proving to myself that I was onto something. And then the next thing you know, it was like, okay, this is my career. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life.
That's an amazing story. See, what I heard is that you had this light bulb moment of connecting the work that you were doing in a completely different field to diversity, equity, inclusion, having gone to events, conferences, and listened and heard. What was it that made you go to those different events that maybe wasn't necessarily or wouldn't typically appeal to someone of your diversity characteristics, white, male, cisgender, exactly what you just said? Why did you attend?
I used to say that I was passionate about diversity and inclusion. What I realize now in retrospect is that I was curious about it. I had my own experiences as an immigrant. Now, coming from Italy, that's hardly a disadvantage. In fact, if anything, it's even more of a privilege. But I knew what it was like to feel different. I have a son and a daughter, but I watched my daughter essentially, even though she was brilliant at maths and other technical fields, she really wanted to have nothing to do with spaces like that, and went into finance and really found herself incredibly uncomfortable as a woman. So I had always been personally interested in that. I love the idea of equity. I love the idea of treating people equally. But I always saw it more as a matter of being an advocate or being some kind of an activist, going out and going to different kinds of marches and things like that. And I always felt like that's not really me. That's not something that I really am contributing to very tangibly. So when I saw an opportunity to bring my work into that space, it felt like a perfect fit. It felt like a very natural thing.
Let's talk about this simulation then. I've watched your TED talk, but for those who haven't, can you explain what is it that you've pulled together in this simulation? Describe the simulation to us, and what is it that it shows?
So the idea of this simulation, this is something that I've been doing literally my entire professional life, is building simulations in which you try to capture the behaviors of individual elements. And the individual elements could be a mechanical part inside a large structure. It could be a neuron inside the brain, which was what my PhD and a lot of my research was about. Or it could be a person within a societal context, such as a company. And the idea is that we understand through psychology a lot about how people react to different circumstances. And then statistically, we know things about how companies work by looking at the aggregate level. But the problem with statistics is that they hide the level of the individuals. So what we do, and when I say we, my former colleagues at previous companies and I, as well as the work that I do now, we build computer simulations that are a little bit like a video game, like The Sims or SimCity, where you're literally replicating very simple aspects of the behavior of individuals and how they interact with each other. And then you allow the computer simulations to play out all of these really complex scenarios, people going to work, having maybe a negative encounter, getting promoted, getting raises, dealing with their personal life in the midst of work. These are things that would be incredibly difficult to capture mathematically, but when you build them into a simulation that looks like the real world, you can then analyze it the same way that you would analyze the real world. So in the case of the simulation that you saw, we took a very simplified idea and we said, well, what if we have a company with 4 layers of people, from entry-level management, VPs, and executives? And what if you imagine that under normal circumstances, people are getting promoted simply on the basis of their level of seniority? So if there is a vacancy at a certain level, you look to the level below, you look at maybe the top 10, 15%, and you choose one of them. Basically, we know that it's related to seniority, but not exactly. And when you do that, you find that regardless of the personal characteristics of people in the company, you always get a fairly equal and fair advancement through the organization. And then we said, well, what happens if the company is not being inclusive by favoring men in the promotion process? So we built a version of the simulation where you have yellow and blue people. The yellow represent women, the blue represent men. And we showed that, again, normally advancement is very even all the way through. And now we said, well, let's give the men a slight advantage in how they're likely to get promoted at each level. And when you run the simulation, you see the people moving around and moving up levels. And very quickly, in the equivalent of 5 to 10 years, you see a company that becomes exactly what you see in the real world, where the top echelons are dominated by men. And then you get fewer and fewer men as you go down until eventually at the entry level, paradoxically, you have more women than men because the women are stuck there while their male counterparts are getting promoted. And so in that simulation, you get this visual impact of seeing what happens to people and how that shapes the overall diversity level of the company. And what's beautiful is that you can also track when people are not getting promoted who feel that they should get promoted, how that impacts their satisfaction. And when you do that, you see that the satisfaction of the women plummets while the satisfaction of the men stays very constant. And that reflects very much what you see in the real world, where you find that women tend to have much higher turnover. And often they truncate their careers or they switch jobs because they're not satisfied because they see all these unfairnesses around them. And so those simulations are very helpful because they help, again, to quantify that link between what happens to individual people in the organization and how does that shape the organization as a whole, both in terms of its diversity and in terms of its performance.
I mean, that is genius and fascinating, and you've opened up a whole load of questions in my mind as a result of that. I mean, I think it's brilliant to look at an individual level and see how it impacts the system. Can I ask then, in terms of using that simulation within organizations, how do they benefit from seeing that simulation and doing something different?
The answer to that is actually surprised me when I discovered what came of that. What happened is that about maybe 5 years ago, I developed a simulation and I was showing it to the chief diversity officer of a very large financial services company. And she looked at it and said, this is fantastic. I want you to build it for my company. I'll give you all of our diversity data. Can you build a simulation for my company? And I realized that I couldn't do that. And the reason why we couldn't do that is because knowing how many men, how many women, how many people of color is not enough. You need to know what are the experiences that people have day to day as a function of their role, their gender, the people that work around them, and how they get treated. In other words, what we realize is that we need to measure not the diversity of a company alone, but we needed to measure inclusion. And by inclusion, we mean specifically the kinds of experiences that people have that lead them to feeling more satisfied, more included, a greater sense of belonging. And I want to be very careful about the word, because people often, when they talk about inclusion and belonging, they talk about the sense of inclusion, the sense of belonging. What we need to know is, why do you feel more or less included? So to us, measuring inclusion eventually boiled down to measuring, in a sense, exclusion, measuring the things that happen that are different between groups of people that cause one group of people to have worse experiences than other groups, which then translates into lower performance, lower retention rates, slower advancement, and things of that sort. And so what happened is that we were using the simulation thinking, oh, we're going to build a big strategic platform, but we ended up making a 90-degree pivot, if you will, and we developed a way of collecting exclusion data that is essentially a way of measuring inclusion kind of in reverse. And we found that just measuring that provides tremendous insights to companies without even using the simulation. So the simulation has become more of an educational tool. But what we really do now is focus on measuring inclusion so that we can go back to companies and say, this is exactly what is happening in your company. This is what's causing problems for different groups of people. And here's how you can address those issues.
Are you able to offer an example of an issue, something that's come up maybe thematically with a few organizations, and what is it that they could do to address it, just as an example?
Absolutely. One of the things that surprised us a little bit, and in retrospect, it's not that surprising, is that we ask people, we go through these inclusion measurement exercises where we show the simulation, we talk about some background ideas, and then we ask people anonymously using our online platform to share experiences that have made them feel uncomfortable. Not necessarily excluded, because sometimes you don't know whether something that happens is unpleasant because of your skin color or not, or your gender, whatever the case might be. And we have a selection of what we call the categories of inclusion. There's things like work-life balance, compensation and benefits, career advancement, recognition, respect. And then we also ask them, what was the source of this uncomfortable experience? Was it your management, your leadership? Was it a policy? Was it your peers? So when we do that, we get this incredibly granular data accompanied by qualitative descriptions of exactly what happens to people. And we found a couple of things that are universal. One, respect or the lack thereof is by far the most common situation that causes people to feel uncomfortable at work. And this can range between very personal disrespect. I can tell you one company, we had somebody make a comment, which we always ask people if we can share comments anonymously, and we actually don't know who the people are, so we wouldn't be able to trace them anyway. But to give you an idea, we heard people say, my manager told me that I would be a happier person if I went to the gym twice a week. Or somebody else that said, oh, that technical information would interest your boyfriend or your husband, but not you.
What?
Yes, exactly. And you hear things like that all the time. But you also hear more general senses of disrespect. Like in the United States, as you know, a couple of years ago, the administration decided that Martin Luther King Day is a national holiday. And apparently somebody said how during a big town hall meeting of their entire company, one of the VPs said something along the lines of, oh, MLK is not a real holiday, we should not take it off. So imagine being one of the few Black people in a company like that and hearing your VP saying that in front of the whole company, how that would make you feel. So the number one thing that we found is that lack of respect is a major, major driver of the experiences people have at work. The second thing that we found is that women in every single organization that we've looked at, and we're talking about global organizations, domestic, small, large, women always, always, always have much more exclusion. They feel much more exclusion. They experience much more exclusion than men. And the kinds of things that we see also very common. Behavior related to meetings, both in terms of not being invited to meetings where they feel they should be invited, but also when you're in the meeting, and I'm sure this will sound familiar to you, you say something, you get interrupted by the guy next to you, or you say something, people don't understand it, the guy next to you repeats it, and they're like, oh my gosh, Paul, you're so smart. Those kinds of things are incredibly pervasive. So some of the things that we recommend to people is say things like, okay, if this is a problem in this area of your company, make sure that you tell the managers two things. One of them, make a list of who should be in which meetings. And every time you organize a meeting, check that box to make sure that everybody's there. And two, have someone in the meeting, or ideally you as the manager, make it your responsibility to amplify the voices of women and other members of a branded group, and make sure that if somebody's constantly cutting in and constantly interrupting, that you politely but firmly say, hey, you've already spoken a lot, let's let somebody else have their turn. And there are many, many other examples like that are really intuitive. Once you see them, you're like, duh, that makes perfect sense. But when you see numbers associated with them and you can link them to the performance of the company, it's a complete game changer because it really shows managers why they should care about these things and how to fix them.
Yeah, I completely get that it makes it a reality for them. It's their data from their organization, not in general, not theoretically. It's what's happening right there. I still feel and get a sense, though, even though some of these managers are seeing this data, is this real? Is it really happening? You're telling me I need to look out for men maybe talking over women or offering an idea that a woman... You're saying that, but I've never seen it play out before. I can keep a lookout for it, but honestly, it doesn't happen in my meetings. How do you navigate that?
There are really two ways of addressing that question. One of them is that we came up with an interesting analogy. We tell people that inclusion is invisible. And the way that we argue that is by bringing up the analogy with health. When you meet somebody, you don't say, hi, I'm Paolo and I'm healthy today. But if I happen to have a cough, or if my voice is hoarse because I had to go sick, or if I had a cast or something, the conversation of my lack of health would come up. So we don't notice when we're healthy, we notice when we're unhealthy. Similarly, we don't notice when we're being included, we notice when we're excluded. Now, what does that mean? If I'm a healthy person and I go to the doctor and they tell me about different diseases, I don't really understand diseases because I've never had them, I don't experience them. Similarly, if you are a very included person, then exclusion is completely invisible to you, which means that the most included people in the organization are the ones that are least familiar with and least likely to ever experience or believe that these kinds of things actually happen in their companies. One of the beauties about doing work the way that we do it is that it's different than, let's say, doing focus groups and having a group of people complain about something. Because then you can always say, oh, they're complaining because of this and that. When we do measurement across the whole company and you compare the results for men versus women or for white people versus people of color, it is black and white. You absolutely cannot lie. You cannot say, oh, wait a second, maybe this is just a fluke. And I can tell you that I've had on at least 2 occasions, I've had white male leaders to whom we presented the results behind closed doors who literally broke down and cried and said, I cannot believe this stuff is happening in my company. And so that's really the first aspect of it. But there's a second aspect of it is that this is where linking it to KPIs and company performance is so crucial. Because if I show you a simulation, or even without a simulation, if I say, look, in your organization, these things are happening to the women more so than to the men. And then you look at your organization and you find that your retention rate for women is 10% lower than it is for men, and you know how much it costs you to replace a worker at different levels. You can literally put dollars and cents or euros and cents or pounds and pences into an equation and say, oh, the fact that I am being twice as exclusive toward women as I am toward men is costing me £1 million a year. That's when it becomes really tangible. So it's the combination of make them aware that they don't see exclusion, but that does not mean that it's not there. Quantify the existence of exclusion in their organization and then tying it to the performance of their business. This is not, you said something very interesting before, right? You hinted at the fact that a lot of the arguments for diversity and inclusion are based on these statistical, on average, companies that are more diverse perform better. But leaders don't run their companies based on statistics. They run their companies based on what they can do for their organization. And that's really what's kind of revolutionary about what we do, is that we tell them how to fix things and the impact that not fixing things is having on their organization.
Yeah. It hits to the point to all of those leaders who are sitting there and going, I don't see it. And why do we need to do anything differently? We're a successful organization. And it really gets to, well, bottom line, this is what women are experiencing, or this is what your ethnic minority individuals are experiencing, or whoever. And you can see in the statistics what's happening in terms of your fallout for those people. So in your Forbes articles, you speak a lot about the complexities of diversity and inclusion, a lot about them. And that's sort of the heart of what you talk about. I love that because actually trying to navigate those complexities, I come up against them all the time in my work with particularly male leaders and white leaders and heterosexual leaders, those who fit into what seemingly is the majority characteristic in most organizations, feeling like I don't get it, but now basically being me is a detriment to my career progression. There's nothing for men in the organization. I see all of these positive action programs, and I don't trust if I go for a promotion or if I go for a job that they're going to choose me, because I know that they're hoping to get their diversity statistics up. How do we navigate that complexity?
Yeah, that's a real challenging problem. And we're hearing a lot more of that. I think that after the big wave of increased interest in DEI in the last couple of years, since the murder of George Floyd and the pandemic and everything that happened, we're now starting to see a lot of retrenchment and backlash. I think there is, again, a couple of different ways of thinking about it. A fundamental point that I make in all of my writing and all of my speaking is the fact that focusing on diversity and specifically focusing on numerical representation alone is a mistake. Because first of all, diversity, it takes a very long time and a lot of turnover before you can significantly impact diversity. But diversity really, to me, is an outcome. It's the result of everything that you do, not only who you recruit, but also how you treat the people that you recruit and how much effort you put into their education, their growth, their advancement, etc. So focusing on diversity alone is a mistake. And one of the reasons why it's a mistake is because it gives rise to exactly the kind of sentiment that you're describing. It's that zero-sum game mindset. If you're going to double the number of Black people, then it means that you're going to reduce the number of white people, which if it's a closed system, it's true. You can't avoid that. Instead, what we try to point out to people is that, yes, there are a lot of inequities. It's completely unfair, the fact that there are so few women in leadership roles, so few people of color in leadership roles. But really, the point is that you need to create a more inclusive organization. And by creating a more inclusive organization, you create a more highly performing organization that will attract naturally more diverse talent. Of course, you still have to make efforts to recruit, etc. When you talk to people about making efforts to be more inclusive as opposed to making efforts to increase the number of a particular group, you're taking away that sense of, oh, well, because I'm not Black, because I'm not a woman, because I don't have a disability, I'm now disadvantaged. The reality is that when people ask me those questions in a conference, for example, it's very awkward because, you want to say, oh, come on, you're being an idiot, look at the data. You want to say that. But the problem is that if that person is asking a question, half of the room is thinking it.
Absolutely.
So now you have a lot of people that are thinking this guy's an idiot, and a lot of people that are thinking this guy's great, he's asking exactly what I'm thinking about. And so walking that fine line is, I have to say, one of the most uncomfortable things that has happened to me. And I know that's one of the things that you like to talk about is discomfort, right? And so you have to acknowledge that for a single individual being told by their manager that their promotion has been delayed because they need to interview more Black people, to them, it stinks. It's unpleasant. But the fault is not that the guy is a jerk. The fault is that the organization should never create an environment in which you are told that your position is being, or your promotion is being delayed because they're trying to hire a Black person. If instead the organization looked at their numbers and said, look, of the last 50 people that were promoted, we have found that the vast majority were white men and only a tiny percentage of our existing women and people of color were promoted, it means that there's something that we're doing that is wrong. It means that somehow our processes have biases, or they're allowing biases to creep in that they shouldn't. So to me, a huge part of answering the question is to sidestep it by saying, look, let's not focus so much just on the numbers and representation. Let's focus on creating an environment where everybody has an equal chance to succeed. And I guarantee you that the numbers will then work themselves out. And we will truly have the best people in the best positions instead of having advantaged, privileged, often white men who might have advanced in their career because of privilege that they did not even see. And that leads to the disparities that we see.
And that's the hardest part, isn't it? Exactly what you've just said, privileges that they did not see. And you were talking about the absence of exclusion before. So we don't really see inclusion when we feel excluded. And it's the same with privilege, isn't it? So
exactly.
We don't see the privilege that we have. And so therefore, if we have a recruiting manager that's saying, oh, we just need to pause for a moment just because we need to see more people of colour or ethnic minority individuals, and then someone of an ethnic minority background gets the job, it on the surface seems incredibly unfair and unjust. Because if you fundamentally believe that the system was fair and just in the first place, then it seems like we're skewing the process now. That's the issue, isn't it?
Exactly, you're spot on. It's the fact that we do not notice. If one day we get a promotion, we may not realize that there was a peer of ours who happened to be a woman or Black who didn't get promoted, who maybe had slightly better qualifications than we did. We don't see that. We just say, oh, hey, I got promoted, I deserve to get promoted. But if somebody points out that, oh, we're going to promote that person because he's Black, you're doing a disservice both to me and to that person. Because now they have this stigma where they're considered, the diversity promotion or the diversity hire. So again, that's one of the many reasons why I argue very strongly that this obsessive focus on diversity alone, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. But 99% of the data and 99% of the initiatives are only focused on that D. And that's a terrible mistake. We really need to focus much more on the I, on the E, on all of the pieces that, one of the ways that I like to summarize diversity, equity, inclusion. To me, inclusion is what you do. Equity is what you aspire to, and diversity is what you get. It's very simple. Diversity is just a snapshot of who is in your company today. And if I may tell you kind of a funny analogy, as you might tell, I like analogies. I give people another analogy. When we talk about diversity, very often the thing that people focus on is hiring. I'm just going to hire more diverse people. But if you hire people from a different background who then come into your company and they're uncomfortable, their manager doesn't treat them well, and they feel segregated and not treated well, they will leave, right? So it can backfire. And trying to fix diversity directly is fixing the symptom. And the analogy that I tell people is that imagine that I was in the house and my wife came to me and said, oh, honey, it's so cold. Look, the thermometer reads only 11 degrees centigrade. And I say, oh, honey, I'll fix that. And I'll light a match under the thermostat. And now look, the thermostat reads 25 degrees. And meanwhile, the windows are open, the door is broken, and the roof is leaking. And when we try to stuff diverse employees, especially at the entry level, that's all you're doing. You're not fixing the problem, you're fixing the symptoms.
That's a brilliant analogy. It's exactly right. And what you've just said really resonates with me. And I hear a lot about the conversation when I'm trying to talk about inclusion and creating an inclusive culture, supporting leaders, what it means to lead inclusively and so that teams feel and experience inclusion. Often I hear that the issue is less about the organization and what we're like, it's that we can't get women in. The industry itself lacks women. So how are we meant to get the women in if they're not there in the first place?
So one of the many talks that I like to give regularly, there's one that I call DEI Mythbusters. And I debunk a lot of these kinds of myths, and the pipeline problem is one of them. And what I find stunning about that argument is that, first of all, a company is not an open field that people just randomly walk through. It's like, oh, well, look, there's only 12% women with engineering degrees. And so how can we have more than 12% women in our engineering departments? And then, of course, you have 6% anyway to begin with. But I think, look, if you're building a product and you need a certain part and it needs to be high quality, are you going to look around and say, well, the average quality of this part is really mediocre, so I'm going to settle for a mediocre part? I mean, the idea that somehow the number of people out there is a driver of who we're going to get, it's a form of laziness. And one thing that I tell people is when I created Aleria and I was a solopreneur and I wanted to build a team, my first big hire that I wanted to have, I'd already hired one other person, but I needed to hire a technical product manager. And those roles are typically dominated by men. I did not want a man because I knew that it was important for me to get diversity within my own organization. So what did I do? I reached out to some women that I knew. I asked them where they looked for jobs. I did an internet search on women, technology, job boards, etc. I got 86 resumes. 82 of them were from women. I hired one of the women, Lisa Russell, who's now the CEO of Aleria. She's an absolute kick-ass, incredible woman, and I'm grateful that I found her. And it took me a little bit of effort, but I mean, come on, I got 82 out of 86 resumes were from women. And I guarantee you that that's not the ratio of men to women in the technical product manager field. So really, when people talk about the pipeline problem, with all due respect, it's just a silly excuse. There's no excuse for it.
I'm totally with you. And that's one thing that I do offer to them in the politest way. Where is it that you're fishing for these people? If you're going and fishing in the same pond, you're going to get the same type of fish.
Absolutely.
I would love to talk to you about DEI readiness, because you mentioned that an area I know is all about measuring inclusion, data, metrics. What do you call DEI readiness? Is it about organisational maturity? Is it about where an organisation needs to be in order to be able to be more inclusive?
The single most important element of the success of an organization in terms of DEI is to have full support of the leadership. And to me, the level of DEI readiness really is reflected first and foremost in how genuinely willing is the leadership to make the effort that is needed and the investment that is needed to embrace DEI throughout the organization. Now, one of the things that I've realized is that if you frame it in terms of lofty goals of equality and targets that seem incredibly difficult to reach, and the business case based on statistical data over hundreds of companies, I find that unfortunately, a lot of those arguments fail to link directly to how do I make my organization and why should I do that? And so if I may, I would like to give you what I call my minute and a half compelling argument for why every leader of every organization should treat DEI as their number one strategy. And it goes like this. First, if you think of your people as an asset, just like any asset of a company, you have financial assets, you have marketing assets, you have inventory, you have products, right? For all of those other areas, we have tools to help us diversify our assets. So you have portfolio management for financial assets, you have programmatic for advertising, you have optimization of diversification of your products, of your inventory, et cetera, et cetera. For people, we don't have that. If I give you a magic wand, then you can magically change half of the men in your company to women, and I ask you, how will that impact your performance? You have no way of estimating that. So the first part of the argument is, why don't we focus on understanding the impact of diversifying your human assets? But then the second part comes by pointing out the value of those human assets. And I found data only for the United States, but I believe this is true fairly globally. In the United States, in 2019, every single company across the entire country, across every advertising channel, spent the grand total of $250 billion. That's a lot of money. When you take all companies in the United States, the same market, and you look at how much money they spent on payroll, they spent $7.4 trillion on payroll.
Wow.
30 times as much as advertising. So here is my question to every leader of every organization. You have an asset that on average costs you between 10 and 50 times more than your advertising. And you don't know how to optimize it. You don't know how to diversify it to get more efficiency out of it. To me, that's a dismal failure of leadership. Period. End of story. If you have 50 people working in your marketing and advertising department, you should have 1,500 people, 30 times as many people working to ensure that your human assets are maximized, that they're happier, that they're productive, that they're satisfied, that they're not turning over. I'm not saying that absolutely everybody has to have a certain percentage of people or whatever, but I'm saying that if you're not focused on your personnel, on your people, you're failing. And if somebody figures out how to optimize that with diversification, they will absolutely dominate the marketplace.
That's brilliant and really speaks to the importance of leadership in an organization and them all getting it, all understanding it, all putting energy into it, but not just because it's the right thing to do, but because they really, really understand the impact and the importance of the impact of inclusion on their people and on their business. We're swiftly coming to the end of our conversation. I can't actually believe how quickly that's gone, and I've still got loads I would love to ask you. But let's come to this question that I have around discomfort. So as you know, I'm writing a book called Beyond Discomfort. and it's around how inclusive leadership is so hard. And I'm asking all of my guests, what is the discomfort that you've had to navigate that actually by leaning into that discomfort and understanding that discomfort and allowing it to be has allowed you to be a better inclusive leader?
Well, I would say in my line of work, and there's certainly been personal situations in which in my interactions with colleagues and partners, etc., there have been times when there have been some discomfort because of racial, gender, age sensitivities. But I think the true discomfort for me, and I already hinted at this in an earlier answer, is being in an audience where somebody will stand up. I had my first experience, I was speaking with a group of maybe a couple hundred women, and there were a few men in the audience. And at the end of the presentation, one man turned out, this was on Zoom, and he asked a question. He said something along the lines of, well, let's face it, first it was diversity, now it's diversity and inclusion. The reality is that a lot of talented men are sitting by the sidelines because women are being hired in their place. And when you first get asked a question like that in front of an audience, and I mentioned before, it's that struggle of, oh my God, my first instinct that I want to tell the guy, seriously, it's like, look at the data. Come on, you can't be serious about it. But you realize that these people see things that impact them directly, and you cannot deny that. Denying somebody's experience would be exactly the same mistake that a lot of white people do to people of color and that a lot of men do to women. So you don't want to do that. But what that highlighted for me is that unique discomfort of being truly an interface between two very, very different groups of people. The people who look like me, the people who have the same background that I have, who have certain beliefs, who have certain views about DEI, even though they may not actually be expressing them openly. And then the people who do not look like me, who have experiences, like yourself, I'm sure, that make them feel the injustice, that make them experience these things. And the difficulty of understanding both sides. Now, I will never know what it's like to be a woman or to be gay or to have a permanent disability or to be Black. I can educate myself about it. I can surround myself with people who can help me to understand that. So when I find myself in between, that's without question the greatest discomfort that I have. It's seeing both viewpoints, seeing what elements of both viewpoints are reasonable from their perspectives and seeing which ones are perhaps less reasonable, and then trying to answer those kinds of questions or address those kinds of issues in a way that will acknowledge the difficulties that each side is having, but also make them aware of the other side in a way that is not about guilt and it's not about shaming people. It's not about challenging their beliefs. I would say that's probably the most awkward thing. You mentioned an article that I wrote. That article that I wrote about how to respond to answers like that was without question the most difficult article I've had to write, because I felt that I was walking on eggshells and I felt that I had to write it super carefully so that it would appeal to everybody regardless of where they come from.
And I hear that because that's exactly the line that I'm walking when I'm writing this book. So I'll be tapping on your shoulder a few times, maybe just so you could help me navigate that fine line, because you did it incredibly well in that Forbes article. And we'll share the link to your Forbes articles and your TED Talk on the show notes page. Paolo, it has been such a pleasure to get to know you and hear about your just brilliance and creation of these simulations and how you're creating that business case that makes sense to leaders who are taking ownership of creating inclusion and shifting that focus from the D to the I in the hope of the E. And I love that. I love everything that you're doing at Aleria. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, Nadia, thank you. And being one of the few people that I've ever run across who's actually doing meaningful work in inclusion, with your work at Avenir and the book that you're writing, I think your work that you do is exceptional. So again, it's a real honor for me to be part of this.
Thank you. And if people did want to get in touch with you, are you on social channels?
My primary social channel right now is LinkedIn. I have a Twitter account, but I'm not very active on it. But LinkedIn is the best way to get a hold of me. And as you pointed out, I have a Forbes blog which I write regularly. I've written over 100 pieces in that blog. So those are probably the two best ways to find out more about work.
Excellent. An absolute pleasure, Paolo. Please be well, and I'll catch up with you soon.
Likewise, and thank you again, Nadia. Take care.
That concludes episode 29 of the Why Care podcast. Paolo offered some great analogies there, which I found incredibly helpful in explaining the cynicism and backlash surrounding DEI. It was also valuable to get his perspective on how we can focus more on inclusion rather than diversity. Do let Paolo and I know what you thought of today's show. You can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter with the handle @Nadia Nagamutu. As always, I really appreciate your support of this podcast through leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening and spreading the word by sharing it with your friends and family. Huge thanks to Mauro Kenji for editing this podcast and Glory Olubori for supporting with the show notes and getting it out there on social media.